Hi, this is Ted Pattison. I have a small training company named Critical Path Training, and we've put together a webinar on developing custom visuals for Power BI. Now, before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a GitHub repository that has all the sample code I'm going to show over the next hour and also the slides you're going to be looking at. And this repository is at github.com/criticalpathtraining/custom visuals for Power BI. So please go ahead, download the code, kick its tires, test it out. I'll begin with an introduction that provides an overview of custom visual development in Power BI. Then we'll have two sections which are background primers. We'll talk about moving from JavaScript to TypeScript, and we'll talk about getting started with the D3 library, and both those sections we'll talk about before we even broach the topic of custom visual development. Once we start custom visual development, you have to learn about the pbiviz utility, how to create projects, and how to start debugging sessions so we can test our projects. We'll then look at the issues of designing and implementing robust custom visuals, and then we'll finish up with a discussion of packaging and the distribution of custom visuals as pbiviz files. Now, as I am sure you are well aware, Power BI comes with a pretty powerful set of built-in visualization types. So when you're building reports and dashboards and you need a table, a matrix, bar chart, pie chart, tree map, funnel, gauge, you need to add a slicer for interaction, you need some type of a map, Power BI is there for you with the built-in visualization type. However, there will be lots of scenarios in both business applications and scientific applications where the built-in visualization types just don't give you the control that you need. So one of the big strengths of the Power BI platform, especially compared to the competition, such as Tableau, is the ease in which a developer can extend the platform by creating a custom visualization type. As a case in point, Microsoft has established the Custom Visual Gallery, and some of the community's top talent has created custom visuals and have made them available to all of us. If you go to app.powerbi.com/visuals to the visual gallery and you see a visual you'd like to use, it's very easy to leverage that work. So what we're going to do in the first demo is not to develop, but show custom visuals from the consumer side. And what you'll see is that I can download a custom visual, which is basically a pbiviz file. And once I have downloaded this custom visual file, I can import it into either my Power BI desktop project or into a Power BI workspace. And that brings us to our first demo, and more particularly our first visually gratuitous demo, importing the hierarchy slicer control custom visual. Okay, let me navigate to a report I've been working on up in the Power BI service. So I've added two slicers, one for the sales region and one for the state. A sales region is a set of states, so there's really a hierarchy. But while I can use the two different slicers to get back and forth, there's still the case where they don't reset. They're really not seeing each other in a hierarchy. So I'm going to go to the custom visuals gallery, and I'm going to go ahead and seek out this one custom visual, which is the hierarchy slicer. I'll click download visual, and it will go through the process of downloading a zip archive that has a pbiviz extension to my machine. Now, don't tell anyone I'm telling you to do this, but if you copy that file and you give it a .zip extension, you can open it up and see exactly what's inside. Okay, forget I told you about that. Let's go ahead and take the pbiviz file, and now I'll go into my personal workspace, go into edit report mode, and I can import that custom visual into my personal workspace, or I can do the same to import it into any group workspace. Now I have this new visual, so I'll get rid of the two out-of-the-box slicers, and we'll add the hierarchy slicer inside there. We'll now go up and we'll find my customer geography, which is a hierarchy of the customer, and now I'm able to drill down either at the sales region or at the state level, and the visual basically sees the relationship, the parent-child relationship between the sales region and the state. Okay, great. I've just done that, inside the browser. Now I'm going to move over to Power BI Desktop and show you can also import the custom visual on a per project basis. And the custom visual code just lives within the PBIX project file inside there. And so now we go ahead and we add the exact same custom visual to my Power BI desktop project. Now, with the first demo, I was trying to whet your appetite. Of course, I showed you how to be a custom visual consumer. That's not what you're all about. You want to be where the action is. You want to be a custom visual author. a producer. So what are the learning curves that you're going to have to go through? Now, I'm going to assume that you've already worked with JavaScript. So you're going to have to migrate from JavaScript to TypeScript programming if you have not done that already. Next, you're going to learn how to program with various JavaScript libraries. The d.ts library in particular is the most popular one. Not the only one you can use, but definitely a place that you should start. Also, you have to get up to speed on creating and managing projects with the pbiviz utility, what we call the PowerBI developer tools. Next, you have to learn how to design custom visuals. There's interfaces that are going to be involved. There's view models that you can build over the data structures that are passed to you. And there's different ways to implement them when you want to add things like custom properties. So we have to go through, learning how to take advantage of those. And then finally, we have to learn how to package the custom visual into a pbiviz file so that we can distribute it to the world. Okay, time to move on to our second section, programming in TypeScript. Now, while in theory, it's possible to create custom visuals in JavaScript and not use TypeScript, in practice, it's impossible because the whole tool set we're going to see assumes that you've learned TypeScript. Now, what is TypeScript? It's basically a language that someone designed on top of another language. They built TypeScript on top of JavaScript to deal with some of the problems that JavaScript has. JavaScript is not strongly typed. JavaScript does not have object-oriented constructs like class and interface. So Anders Heidelberg and his team at Microsoft began building the TypeScript language so that you could program in a strongly typed object-oriented language, and behind the scenes they would compile your TypeScript code in .ts files into .js files. But as far as the browser is concerned, your TypeScript code has to be converted into JavaScript code before it's actually going to execute within the browser. But most of the compilation happens behind the scenes. Now, when we start programming in TypeScript, the first thing that you have to embrace is the whole idea that unlike JavaScript, we have types that we can basically assign to variables and function parameters and function return values. So on the slide here, what you're seeing is a couple examples of I define a function, I better go ahead and define a type for the parameter. I define a return value. Every time I type a particular variable, we're going to go ahead and give it a particular type. This is what we call type annotation. Now, what's important to see is that JavaScript does not support type annotation. So type annotation is just used as they compile your TypeScript into JavaScript to make sure that you have programmed your types as you should and that you don't have bugs in your code. But by the time the compilation process is done and we basically created the JavaScript file, there's no trace of type annotation. So it all basically gets erased during compile time. Now, the next thing we have to look at is just a couple features. One is casting between types. So let's say that I create a variable based on the object type. Just like the .NET framework, just like Java, we have this basic object type at the top. Now, I assign a value that's numeric, but what I cannot do is take that variable x and just assign it to a number variable because it is a compile time error. So what we can do is we can use the casting syntax where we put the type in the angled brackets inside there. Now, what's a lot less obvious, but cool once you know it, and also cool because the new guy can't read your code, is that when you want to cast something to a numeric type, you can just put a plus sign in front of it. Now, some of the other things that you're going to see, especially as you get into Power BI visual programming, is the use of template strings. So the idea of a template string is, first of all, you don't use either the single or the double quote. Instead, you use the backtick to start and stop your strings. Then what you're able to do is put $, open curly brace, close curly brace, and they're able to take that particular dynamic value and parse it into the string. So it's a very easy syntax to use. Now, another big part of coming of age as a TypeScript programmer is learning how to use arrow function syntax. The short story is that this syntax is used to create anonymous functions that you can assign to things like event handlers. And so what we do is we use the parentheses to add the parameter list. And if there are no parameters, you just have the open and close parentheses, so it looks kind of like the hairy eyeball. And then you have equals greater than, which is basically the arrow operator. And then we basically have open and close curly brace. So here's a case where I create a parameter list that's not full. And then down here, we go ahead and we create the function body inside. Now, as you're just doing regular type programming, note that when we define these and we define the parameters, we can strongly type the parameters. So parameter 1 is a number, parameter 2 is a string. My function return value is going to be string. So that's the end of the parameter and return value list. And now we have the arrow operator, and then I just open the curly brace and I basically code my method inside there. Now, another important piece of syntax that you're going to need is knowing how to program classes. So notice on the screen there, we have class product. And just like I'm in Java or C# or VB.NET, an object-oriented language, I can go ahead and create a class. Note that the export keyword that we use here, that's required when you define this class in one source file and you want it to be available to use in another source file. And behind the scenes, they're going to take this class construct that you've created and create a lot of funky JavaScript code to basically give us the equivalent. Now, when it comes to class constructors, you're probably used to those in other languages, maybe C#. So we have constructors, and note that there's actually a really neat thing that they do, and that's they don't use the class name, they use the word constructor. So when you copy and paste constructors from one class to another, you don't have to change its name. Now, another thing that I want to point out is that when you add parameters to a constructor, you can mark them as public or private. And what this does is it automatically creates and initializes a field in the class of the same name. So rather than C# where you're passed a parameter and you have to do something with it to hold on to it, here you just mark it as private or public and it automatically holds on to it. Now, as a for instance, once I've created public or private properties in the same class, you can access that by saying this.id, this.pricename. One other thing I want to point out is unlike C#, when you reference a field from within a class, the this parameter is required. It's a discipline they've built into the language, so you can't just refer to ID, you always have to refer to this.id to get at a field. Well, finally, let's look at the two things that we've marked as public. We've marked name as public and category as public, and when we write client-side code against that class, those are automatically available. Well, the next thing we want to look at is interfaces. So you can define an interface inside of TypeScript, and then you can have one or more classes that implement interfaces. So interfaces have been mainstream in software application design for decades. I remember back in the days of COM, the component object model, working with interfaces, and also in C# and in Java. So the idea is the interface defines a programming contract apart from any concrete implementation, and then I can create as many classes as I want that implement the interface. And when we write client-side code against the interface definition, we're able to basically remove one concrete class and put in another, kind of a plug-and-play mentality, because they all implement the same programming contract. Now, the last thing we want to talk about with TypeScript in this primer section is TypeScript Definition Files. So when we program TypeScript, it's very common we want to program against libraries like jQuery and D3 and Angular 1 and Angular 2 and Angular 3, 4, and 5 when they show up. So what we need is a way that we can program against JavaScript libraries in a strongly typed fashion. So these different JavaScript libraries have TypeScript definition files that have d.ts extensions. And the idea is that someone has put together the type information so that when I program against jQuery or D3, I get compile time type checking and I get IntelliSense. Now, let's go ahead and move to our second visually gratuitous demo. And we're going to look at a demo project called D3 TypeScript Demo, and this is part one. Remember, this project, D3 TypeScript demo, is available in the GitHub repository. Now, let's begin. This is just a regular Visual Studio ASP.NET project. I'm doing everything with client-side code, but if I go to Manage NuGet Packages, what I want to show you here is that we have added in the jQuery package, not just for jQuery, but also for the jQuery TypeScript type definition. I've also added in D3 and the TypeScript definitely typed type definitions for D3 as well. Now, there's the index.html file. Not going to dig into that in this demo, but let's go into the app folder and look at two TypeScript files. So there is a visuals.ts file. And in here, I've defined an interface, which is a viewport. How much real estate does someone have to work with? A width and height. And also an interface for a custom visual. Now, don't get confused here. This is nothing to do with PowerBI. I just have a proof of concept where I've created a custom visual interface. Every custom visual has a name. It has a load method and an update method. And then we have a bunch of different visuals that all are able to implement the same interface inside here. So here's the first one where we're going to say hello jQuery. And here's some jQuery code. Notice that once I have the type definition files inside there, I can strongly type fields like container and message to the jQuery object inside here. And now here's my update. Whenever someone calls update and passes me some object of type viewport, I'm going to be able to get the width and height and basically create my visual. Now, if we look over in the app.ts file, what we're going to see is that we have this set of objects that all implement iCustomVisual. So this application doesn't really care what the concrete class is as long as they're dealing with objects that implement iCustomVisual. Now, here is the jQuery document ready function. First thing here, let's get rid of this old funky syntax and let's replace it with our new cool syntax for the arrow function inside there. And so let's go ahead and just run this and see what it's going to look like. I'll go ahead and run the demo right here. And what you can see is we have this interface-based design. And in our interface-based design, we're able to test out our different custom visuals. And so here's the first one with jQuery. Note that I can move it around. And the host application is going to call update on the custom visuals. And also note that with this particular application, we'll revisit this after we talk a little bit about D3, but you're able to basically look at other visuals and load them all in. And now, after our quick primer on TypeScript, let's move ahead to one more quick primer on working with the D3 library. Now, the D3 library, let's take a step back. What does this library do? So it's specifically good at loading data into the memory, the application basically, which is the browser. It's also really good at binding the data you loaded in to create a visual by basically creating a set of SVG elements. Now, another strength of the D3 library is its ability to easily add and remove the SVG elements as you add and remove data elements from the data set. Now, the other skills that you have to learn is how to transform the SVG elements. You're going to create things like rectangles and ellipses and lines. And so you have to figure out how to set properties with your TypeScript code to be able to get the visuals to look the way that you want. And then also there's going to be transitioning. So the D3 library is also really good at setting event handlers on things like the mouse over and click events and being able to react by having the visual change and to be able to do animation so it moves between one state and another state with a slow change that looks visually appealing to the user. Okay, now a little background. What this library is going to do is create SVG graphics. Let's say I didn't want to use the library, I just wanted to hard code the SVG graphics. Now remember, SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And the idea is if you put them in a really small space or a really big space, they're going to adapt and show you high resolution output. And without using SVG in the browser, you're not going to find another technique that gives you the same ability to get so small and then so big without losing some type of accuracy and precision. So here we create this SVG element, we give it a width and height, and then we add SVG elements inside. There's an ellipse, there's a text element, and one of the things that's going to be different if you work with HTML elements but not with SVG elements, which are really a kind of HTML element, what you're going to find is that things like the CX and CY and RX and RY properties might be new. You also might find things like the stroke is just a different name for the exact same property you've known when you're working with HTML elements that aren't SVG graphics. Now, remember that you have to add the D3 library and the D3 library type definition files. We've already done that to this particular project. Now, what you're going to see is that we have strongly typed objects that we can create from the D3 library. D3.selection, SVG element instance. So now let's go ahead and get back into that same demo and look at a couple things that show us how we can start creating graphs and charts with the D3 library. Now, back in our demo, let's begin with this Visual 2 Hello D3. Now, the idea of a custom visual is that it's going to be placed in some container. It doesn't know how big the container is, so it has to adapt to the container. Now, back here, if we go ahead and take a look at this particular source code behind here, what we can see is that we have a load method, and that's where we do our one-time operations. Notice that things are public by default. No need to mark that public. But here, I have a bunch of private fields for an SVG root, an ellipse, a text element, and some padding. Now, in the load, what we're going to do is we're going to initialize the one-time operations. So we're going to create an SVG, and we're going to go ahead and append it to the container that's passed to us. The host passes us the HTML element that we're going to live within. So I'm just going to go ahead and append the SVG inside there. Then we create the ellipse, and we create the text element, and we go ahead and we append them into the SVG root. Okay, so basically after the load method has fired, our three objects have been created. But now in updates where we actually do the work to render it. Now, the first thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to resize the SVG element. So you have a host SVG element right here, and if you don't resize that, it's going to be a clipping region. And so that's just kind of a no-brainer. First thing we do, resize the root element. Next, I'm going to create a plot. And once again, I like to create the plot just because it gives me a variable that lets me see the plot area that I'm going to write into. Then we'll go ahead and we'll write the ellipse inside there. Notice the properties of CY, CX, RX, RY. For the text element, we also want to have this element where when we get small, we better make the text small as well. So what you can see is I just have a little code that looks at the width and height and basically factors in the font size, based on those two elements inside. Okay, so once again, this is a good demo for you to just load in and play with. Let's look at some of these other demos as we go through here. So I want to create a simple bar chart inside. And once again, what we want is we want our bar chart to be able to respond to the user moving the size around. So as I go down here and we take a look, what we're going to do is we're going to create a private variable called bars, and the D3 selection is going to be based on a number. So notice that if all you want to do is create a single rectangle, you can create D3 selection SVG element instance. But now what I want is I want a set of data points that's associated with SVG elements. So we create the bars, and we basically say D3 selection number. Now, when we create the bars, what we're going to do is we're going to take a data set, and note here, we're trying to make things simple and to the point, so I just hard-coded in this data set inside there. Okay, that's not going to always be the case, but I just wanted to take one of the moving parts away as we're describing this. So note that here we have this dot bars, and we go ahead and we add a rectangle, but we're adding a set of rectangles. So what we're able to do here is say data, and we're able to take the data set, and .data.enter is how you take a data set and you add it into this strongly typed collection which is the bars collection. Okay, once we've done that, now down here what you can see is I'm able to use the same SVG root and plot elements, but now what we're going to do is we're going to take those bars, and remember there's a set of data points inside. And so for each one of these bars, we're going to fire this method, set the X attribute, and while I could hard code in a value, for the X attribute, such as the meaning of life 42, what you're also able to do is put a callback function inside there. And the idea is when they pass you that, they're going to pass you the data element. So looking back up at the top here, let me go ahead and collapse that. But you have the first and second and third data element in your set. So down here, they're going to call this once for each element in the set, and they pass you both the data point and its index number in the collection inside there. And so with that, what we're able to do is to basically build the bars inside there. Okay, now here, let's say that we move over to example number 4. We want to add labels in as well. So in addition to the bars, I have a labels, and we go ahead and we add the text element inside there. So I'm just taking the data point and I'm adding the $, kind of a poor man's formatting inside there. Okay, now as we keep going through, I don't want to spend too much time on this demo, but just to give you a sense of what it does, well, next thing we want to do is add in a y-axis. So let's go ahead and look at demo 5. So in demo 5, we're going to start adding in some other elements inside a access group. Now, another thing that you'll find is sometimes you can add your element right to the root. Other times when you have a set of bars, which is a set of rectangles, and then you have other rectangles and you don't want your set of rectangles, to be at the same scope, you create a group, and here you can kind of see that we have the append group. So the idea is you add your group and then you add your rectangles inside of that group so that they're isolated. Now here, we're also going to create this access group. So we have our own group that we can put the access into. And notice that D3, has these different methods. D3.scale.linear, D3.svg.access inside there. So basically I can create these elements. Now let's kind of start with, what is a scale? A scale allows you to take a data set that has a range of values. Let's say my data set goes from 10 to 100, and that's going to be the domain. Well, what is the output or the range? That is the visual width and height that you have to work within. So the idea is you give it the domain of your input values, and then you have your range, which basically says how high should I make the bar, given the fact that the container, is 48 pixels or 600 pixels tall inside there. Now, once we have created the scale, what we're able to do is, let's go down here. Notice that, inside of my bars, I can say this.scale, and scale really becomes a function that you can basically call to take the input value and map it to a width or height in the output range inside there. Okay, now after we've created the particular scale and I want to create the actual access, here's some fairly tricky code to be able to do that, but we call y-axis.scale and we basically figure out the scale, orient left ticks. You have to create this little transform string. So here I'm creating a string value, transform or translate, open paren, there's the padding, there's kind of the X and Y offset. And then finally, I'm going to take the group that I've created, put an attribute, I want to set the access class there, and then I want to call the function for the x-axis, and that is what actually creates the access inside there. Okay, now some of the other things you're going to see. Let's say that I want to have hover events, such that as the user hovers over things inside, I want to be able to capture those events. So let's go down and look at number 6. And inside of update, let's go down here. And all I got to do is tack on these little mouse over and mouse out events. So you can see that without writing much code, it's pretty easy for you to start tapping into different events. Let's say I want to go a little further. And while I can't get very far into it in just a small primer, the idea that you have animations. Let me click on this. And the example is a little bit cheesy that I've created here, but what I wanted to show you is how easy it is to dig in and create an animation. And so I'll just go and show one more of these classes inside here. And now if I go down here, and here is the click event. So once again, what happens when I click on this guy right here? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to handle the click event by basically saying D3 select, let's get the current bar. One little trick here is that here we're not using the new arrow syntax, we're using the old syntax. So if I come through here and kind of change it to the new syntax, I might think, hey, this is great. The problem is that when you use the new syntax, the this pointer switches to the current object created from the class. So it actually, here's a case where you have to use the old function syntax right here because we want the this pointer to be the DOM element that's being passed inside. Okay, that's easy to pick up. But what you can see here is that when this event handler fires, we're going to go ahead and call current bar transition. And let's take a second to do this. And let's go ahead and change the width and height. And then at the end of that, let's go ahead and run another transition. And what we're going to do is transition back to the place we were before. Once again, so it gets to be fairly easy for you, to make bars and lines that don't instantly snap into place, but kind of have this smooth, elegant transition, as they slowly move over to the place inside there. And you'll see a lot of the out-of-the-box visuals in Power BI, have these type of animation effects inside there. Okay, you've waited very patiently to this section where we'll start talking about developing Power BI visuals. Just remember that TypeScript and D3 are important technologies and they're completely separate from Power BI. So I always like the divide and conquer approach to learning a new platform that has lots of technologies that are all new to me. Okay, let's go ahead and start up. Now, when it's time to develop custom visuals, note that there are two different ways. There's the original way, which was created several years back, and many of the custom visuals up in the custom visuals gallery were created this older way. Now, the way is deprecated, which means not that it's not supported. All those custom visuals will still work. It's just no longer the proper way to create it. So it's still supported for backward compatibility. If you look at a sample and you have a visual that has the init method as opposed to a constructor, that's the old style. So what happened last summer in July is they introduced a completely new framework. And what you'll see is that now the iVisual interface that you inherit from has a public update method, and you will add a constructor to your class. Now, what you'll see is that this new method, if you've used the old method and the new method is far preferable. The old method, whenever you made a change, there was a long build process, and it would take, minutes before writing a little piece of TypeScript, you'd see your change in the browser. And now they make it so you have instant gratification. You make a change, save your code, and you can see right away. Now, the tools and documentation for this new style are maintained in a GitHub repository. So if I quickly navigate to this GitHub repository, what you're going to see is that I can go ahead and open this thing up. And so down here, what you'll see is the first page gives me lots of links. If I want to get up and going, pretty much the same thing I'm going to show you, but this is a great resource for you to go back to. There's also a good tutorial about building a bar chart that takes you through lots of things. And if you dig into things like capabilities, what you're going to find is if you click on these MD files, there's good information to drill down onto. So just remember that is a great resource for you to use. Okay, now we have to install the Power BI developer toolchain. For the classic Visual Studio developer, this is going to be a brand new experience. So you're going to start by installing something called node.js. When you install node.js, it installs the Node Package Manager. Then you're going to install the Power BI Visual CLI tool. I'm just going to call that one the pbiviz utility. Once you've done that, you have to do this one-time operation on your dev machine to install a self-signed certificate. Basically, so when you're doing debugging and your files are being served out of localhost, that you can use HTTPS instead of HTTP. Now, you need an editor. And so over the last year, many people have installed Visual Studio Code, which is a lightweight alternative to Visual Studio, and it's great for Node.js style development. Okay, you can use Visual Studio Code. You can also, if you like Visual Studio and the full stack, you can continue to use those, especially if you're using Visual Studio 2017, which has some really nice improvements for doing the Node.js style of development. Now, I'm not going to show you how to install Node.js. Here's a link. You're going to go and install this. It's just going to take a couple minutes. Once you have installed Node.js, note that it's going to install the Node Package Manager, the npm utility. Well, that allows us to take the next step, which is basically to install the Power BI visual tools. So we're going to run a npm command from the command line. You'll see that in the upcoming demo to install these tools. Now, once you've installed the pbiviz utility, you have to do this one-time operation where you're going to call this install cert command, and that's going to step you through the process of installing your certificate on your local machine. You'll see that in the demo coming up. Now, when it's time to create a new project, you're going to call pbiviz new and add your project name. Now, when you create a new project, it's going to create a new folder and put the project inside there, but it's not going to actually move you over. So typically you call PBI new, you put in your project name, it creates the folder, and then you do a change directory to move into that folder. Now, if you want to bring up Visual Studio Code and you want to look like one of the cool kids, you can type in code space dot, which will automatically bring up Visual Studio Code and open the folder that has your project inside. Now, once you start working with it, there's a bunch of files. So I want to call out 3 specific files. There is a package.json file. If you've never worked with Node.js style development before, package.json serves as your project manifest. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be working with the Node Package Manager utility and adding things like third-party libraries. And what you'll see is that these dependencies get added to the package.js file. Now, there's also a pbiviz.json file, and that is going to serve as the manifest for your custom visual. So notice it has things like the visual class name, which initially is visual, but if you want to change your class name from visual to something else, you can update that. Also note, here's what the arrow's pointing out. There's an external JS section inside here. When you add third-party libraries like jQuery and D3, you have to add references to those JS files in the external JS. And this is an important part of both the debugging process and the final packaging process. Now, in addition, there is a tsconfig.json file. And this influences the TypeScript compiler. And as you add type definition files, what you need to be able to do is to update the files list inside of tsconfig with your ds.ts files. And this is what enables compile time type checking and IntelliSense. One last tip, do not add JavaScript files to tsconfig.json. A bunch of folks have done this in the past, and that causes errors. And if you open a project and you see a .js file inside of the files collection inside, remove it, and quite often that will get rid of your compile time errors. Okay, so now we'll move into visually gratuitous demo number 4, getting up and running with the pbiviz utility. Let's open up the Node.js command prompt. And first, I'll move over to the folder where we'll be creating our custom visuals in C Student Custom Visuals. Now, before we can do anything, we're going to use the Node Package Manager npm install command to install the Power BI visual tools. Now, they install in about 6 or 7 minutes. I sped things up here just so I can kind of show you what it's going to look like as you do the installation. And once we've done that, we have a pbiviz utility. So I'm going to call pbiviz install cert. And what that's going to allow me to do is now to install a self-signed certificate on my local machine so that when we use Node.js for debugging, we have localhost as a HTTPS address. Okay, now that we've installed a certificate, we're ready to go. We're going to go ahead and create our first visual. pbiviz new, and viz01 is the name. Now, when you create a new visual, it creates a project. So we'll move over to the project and say code dot. Code dot allows me to bring up Visual Studio Code. Now, in Visual Studio Code, there's the Visuals TS file. I'm going to go ahead, open the Visuals TS file, and they give me enough hello world code just so I can start the project and test it. So pbiviz start is going to start the Node.js debugging session inside there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move into PowerBI. So we're going to log on to my personal workspace, and I'm going to go to any data set because that creates a new report for me. And I look over and I don't see the developer visual. We go to settings. Once we go to settings, there's developer setting. And once I turn that on, we're going to see the developer visual. Now I'm going to take the developer visual, drop it on, and my visual is basically running in that Node.js debugging session inside there. Now, there's a couple different buttons to do the refresh, to toggle auto refresh on, to look at the data, to basically get help, and to send feedback. Okay, now let's say that we want to move back to Node.js and do a simple update right here. Now, I'm going to make the update. Just a second, I'm going to save the file. But what I want to do is let me get the console behind. And I'm going to save the file, and what you're going to see is code automatically starts running to rebuild the project. And then I can hit refresh. Now let's open up Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code, but now there's a open folder command. And so I can open my visual in that folder. And so for me, I just kind of like the Visual Studio experience a little bit better than Visual Studio Code. Note that everything's good to go. We can open Node.js style packages in this new version of Visual Studio. I can see my code right here. And now let's make a couple changes. So let's get rid of some of this stuff they put into that hello world implementation. And I'm just going to add some code that's going to create a simple HTML table. And note that you can use that TypeScript syntax where you have the $ and curly braces, and we can basically put our TypeScript code inside there. And so I'm just using the options parameter that was passed to me. And so now let's go ahead and do our update. And what you can see here is now I've created a little table. Now, one problem I have is whenever I drop it and it stops, too many significant digits. Let's go ahead and patch up our custom visual. I'll come back here into Visual Studio. We'll write a little bit of code to say toFixed2. So basically, let's try it out with 2 decimal places inside. So I write my code, I save my file, the watcher automatically rebuilds, I go ahead and refresh, it looks great. Okay, I still don't like any significant digits. Let's go back and remove those as well. So I'll go back here and we'll switch that to 0 and 0. And now that we've done that, hey, that looks great. Okay, we're almost done. One more thing I want to do. Let's go ahead and open up the .less file. The .less file is where you add your CSS, except when you add it with less, you can add things like variables, and you can take HTML element tags and nest them inside, which you can't do with CSS, and then it basically just rebuilds the CSS. So now that I've added some styling inside there, basically you can see that everything's good to go. Okay, so now you've seen the basic steps to create a custom visual and test it out inside the browser. Let's go ahead and recap those basic steps. First, you create a new project using pbiviz new. Remember, there's one visual per project. You cannot create a project that contains more than one visual. You modify the various files within the project. We sing things like the tsconfig file and the pbiviz.json file. And there's also TypeScript source files, and there's going to be that .less file. Now, once you've extended the class that implements iVisual, you're able to test things out by using pbiviz start to start a Node.js debugging session, and you can debug your code right inside the PowerBI environment in the browser. That's great stuff. Okay, so no time to rest. Let's move to another visually gratuitous demo, number 5, and this time we're going to create a project and add in support for the D3.js library. In an earlier video, creating and testing your first custom visual, you got familiar with the pbiviz utility. So we're going to create a new project called D3Joy. Now I'm going to move over to this project and open it up with Visual Studio Code. Now when I open this particular project, let's go and look at the hello world code that they've built in there for me. I'm not going to change anything inside here, except I'll just go ahead and change the text that we're writing inside there, just some little message so we can see it working before we add support for the D3 library. Now let's go ahead and start a debugging session. pbiviz start, and remember that starts the node.js debugging session for your custom visual. And then we're going to go to the PowerBI service. I'm going to go into my personal workspace, and I've already created a report that has the custom visual, so I can basically just bring that back up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the debugging session. Now we have the project up and running. It's time to add support for the D3 library. So we're going to use the node package manager install command and install D3 at 3, the latest version for version 3 of the D3 library. Note that PowerBI does not yet support version 4, so we're going to use the latest one of version 3. And note that if you look at package.json, you can see the developer dependency inside there. If I refresh, I can see that inside of the node modules folder, there's a D3 folder. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the pbiviz.json file. The external JS section has something where you need to put a reference to any JavaScript library that you use. So we've updated that. Now we've added support for D3. And now on to D3 typed definitions. So once again, we're going to use node package manager at types / D3 at 3. Note that a lot of documentation from Microsoft will tell you to use typings, which is a different utility for installing the D3 library. And what you'll see is that npm install is what people are going to be using going forward. And once you've added the type definition file, you need to then add that into the tsconfig.json file. And so now that you've got that, you're going to have IntelliSense and compile time type checking on your TypeScript code when you use the D3 library. Okay, well now we can start writing some code. So let's go ahead and take the class that they gave us. And so what I'm going to do is go to the top of the class. Let's add some private fields. And so we're going to add one for the SVG root, 2 more for an ellipse, and a text element, which are going to go inside the SVG root. Now in the constructor, I'm going to go ahead and append the SVG to the element that's passed to me in the options parameter. Now I'll create an ellipse. Note that I call style to basically fill things about the ellipse and the text. And note that the constructor is your one-time operations to initialize an object. Now, every time something happens interesting, update is going to fire. So the first thing we're going to do in update is take the SVG root and readjust it to the height of the viewport inside there. If you don't, it will clip. I've created a little plot variable inside there, and I like creating that plot variable just because it makes it easier when I create other SVG elements like the ellipse text. I've added a little bit of code in here for changing font size. Okay, now that we've got our basic code inside there with 3 D3 SVG, we'll go ahead and we'll start the debugger one more time. Let's go back into the browser, hoping for good things here. Now let me get back to a point where I can refresh. Oh, there's my new visual right here. Let's resize. And what you can see is that now we have a D3 visual that resizes. Okay, so now we've done the background of learning TypeScript D3 and the basics of working with the pbiviz utility. So now let's get into some design issues when you build a custom visual. First of all, let's start with a special file called capabilities.json. You define 3 sections: data roles, data view mappings, and objects. And so as you fill in this JSON, you're basically informing the hosted environment, the PowerBI sandbox for running custom visuals, what your visual is capable of, what type of fields that it accepts and it requires. You're also able to set up your data view mappings and create objects for custom properties. Let's look at these 3 in a little bit more detail. So first of all, data roles is how you define what fields you would like the user to add to your custom visual. Now note that there is a kind. And the idea of kind is for every particular data role, you get to specify whether it's going to be grouping. And the idea of grouping would be string-based data, categories, or you have a measure. So every data role has to be defined either as grouping or as measure or as grouping and measure. And this defines whether people are able to drag and drop columns into the well for that particular data role, or they can drop measures or both. Now, next, we'll look at data mappings. The idea of data mappings is that you can put conditions on your data roles. For instance, you could say that for this particular well, I want you to add a measure but not a group, and I only want you to add one. So you can put a maximum level. You might have noticed that some visuals allow you to add as many measures as you want to a well, like the table visual, but others, like the slicer, only allow you to add a single column, doesn't allow measures. So conditions allow you to call out the names, category measure are names of the data roles, and what is the max. Now also note that you can define the data mappings, and there's several different types of data mappings: single, table, matrix, category, and tree. And the idea is typically you want one of these data mappings for your visual, so you only have to worry about one of them. If you're looking at the one in front of you there, it has categorical defined, and typically that would be for using the categorical view. We'll see that in just a second. Okay, last thing is we have an object section, and the object section is where you add custom property values to. So notice that we have an object named oneBigNumberProperties. So basically that shows up, think of it as a custom section inside the format property pane. And then you add individual properties, and the idea is that you can call out to the user different customizations that they can make to your visual. Now, in addition to this JSON, we're also going to have to add some TypeScript code, which we're going to see in the next demo. Which reminds me, let's get on to the next demo. Visual Gratuitous Demo number 6, demoing the oneBigNumber custom visual. If you've downloaded the sample code from the GitHub repository for this webinar, you'll see that there's one project called oneBigNumber. Let's go ahead and start that up. And I'm going to do an npm install. And so that's going to add any project files that are defined in package.json that aren't already downloaded. So just as a rule of thumb, when you've downloaded someone else's project from GitHub and it's an npm style project, run the install command. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do a pbiviz start. We'll go ahead and we'll start up this particular project. And so as I start this project inside there, let's go ahead and access it. We'll go inside the browser. We'll go to the Power BI environment. I'll go to my personal workspace, back to that dev report I was working on earlier. I'll put it into reading mode or into edit mode, and then we'll go ahead and add the custom visual inside there. Okay, now let's go back and take a quick look at the capabilities.json file. So here, what I wanted to show is we only have a single data role. Its name is my value. I'm basically saying I will allow measures, but I won't allow columns. And then also there's a condition, I need at least one and only one. And then also, what is my data view mapping? We're going to stay simple and work with single. Now, when I go back here and I see it says, please add a measure. My visual knows that it doesn't have the data yet and it can't perform what it's supposed to do. Now, if I go ahead and add a measure inside here, let's go ahead and add sales revenue. Notice that all of a sudden things come alive. Also note that if I go back here, I have a min of 1. So the data view wasn't valid until I added that in, but also there is a max of 1. And so if I come back here as a user and now I try to add units sold, a second measure inside there, because I only allow 1, it replaces instead of adding a second one inside there. Now let me go ahead and move over in this custom visual to say show data view. Now when I say show data view, and I'll drop down, we'll go ahead, move to actual size. What you'll see is that you can drill down and see the data view that's coming back to you. Now there's metadata. So when we start working with custom properties, we care about what's inside here. But also I've picked one of these mappings and I've picked single, and down here I can see single value. Now let's get out of the show data view back to the regular view so I can start testing things out inside here. Note that if I move back to the code and I show you the visual.ts file inside here, well, we have different methods inside, but inside update, notice that we're looking at options data view 0. So this data view is going to be null when there's no fields added. And once we add that field and the data view becomes valid, you have a non-null value, and that's how I'm able to call out something, basically saying you need to add a field before I become a valid visual. Now, if there is a data view, you can see that when it's time to pull that number out, we're going to say this.dataview.single. One little thing to note about single is that it is a primitive value, which means you can assign either a number or a date or a string. And this is a change that happened a couple months ago. So some of the older visuals, when you import them to the new model, are going to break. But the idea is that since this can be a number or a text value or a string, you have to do an explicit cast inside there. Okay, remember, let's make it so my new friend can't read this code. We'll put the plus sign in there to basically do the numeric conversion. Okay, well, now you've seen that inside there. Let's go ahead and look at the custom properties. So here, what I wanted to do is kind of have an array of different properties that we could add inside there. For instance, do you want to show the name of the measure or just show its value? Do you want to show it in bold or not? Do you want to go ahead and change the background color and the foreground color inside there? Do you want to switch the font type? Do you want to go ahead and make the font size larger inside? Okay, so the way that this starts is, first of all, you start in the capabilities.json file, and you're going to define the section as a object. Once again, coming back here, you can see that this entire section is the object, and then the individual properties are going to be properties I add to my object. So now I want to add properties such like show name, show font bold, font color, and there's different types. Now, instead of just adding in this JSON, inside of your visual, you're also going to have to add a special method inside there. So there is this method called enumerate object instances. And the idea is that if you implement this method, they will call it at the right time. So once again, here inside of the capabilities.json, you define your capabilities, which informs the host. And once you add one or more objects inside there, they will basically call enumerate object instances once for each object that you've added. Now, what you have to do inside here is to start adding code to add the property values in. So note that they pass me the object name, and if that object name is the one that I've created, I am then going to create what's called a visual object instance. And I'm going to return back an array of visual object instances. And so here we're creating this JavaScript object inside here, and here are the properties that I have. Now, one other important trick here is you have to write a function, and I have a getValue function that pulls the values out. And so here I have a separate function, and we're using T because it's using TypeScript generics. And the idea is you write the function once, and then when you call it, you can put in bool or string or some other type of object inside. Now, let's go ahead and go back to this view, and let's set a couple properties. You've already seen me set properties. Let me go back into the data show view. Let me now drill down here into metadata and objects, and the idea is that they're the different properties. Now, you're only going to see properties where the user has set it differently from the default value. But when the user has set it, well, what we're able to do is basically add the values inside here and pull things out. So as someone goes ahead and changes the show name true or false inside here, let's go back here and kind of see that, as I change this back and forth, each time you change it, they're going to call that enumerate object instances. Let's go back and take a look at this code inside here. And so the idea is that when we add properties, we're going to call this getValue, and there's different types of properties. And so this function right here basically says, if you give me an object, I know how to walk this path. And so basically, as you remember, the path is just coming down here and basically finding the object in question, which in this case just hangs off the metadata inside there, and then it's able to grab those particular values inside there. One other important aspect of this particular project is how I am doing my formatting. Now, the idea here is that you have something like sales revenue, and it's defined as a measure. It already has its formatting defined, and you want to honor whatever formatting request that they have. So in our case right here, I'm utilizing some other packages. In addition to what the Power BI team has put into the main API, there is also a set of utilities. So I've added the Power BI Visuals Util formatting utils inside there. So basically you have to add that with npm. And as you add that inside, let's look at the node modules inside. So here is the formatting utils. It has dependencies on things like Lodash and D3. If you look at the tsconfig file, you can see that we're pointing to all these TS files inside. If I look at the pbiviz.json file, you can also see that we have to point to a bunch of JavaScript files for those utilities. But the big benefit of adding this in is, let's see how I can get my formatting inside. So if I go ahead and look at update inside, notice that I'm going to call to Power BI utilities formatting value formatter. And that object is really kind of a factory. So I've called mine value formatter factory. I then call create, and note that I can get the column, and I can get the column's formatting string inside there. So once again, if I go back here and I go back into the data view, we now drill down inside of metadata and columns, and we find a particular column. So here there's only going to be one column, which is going to be column 0. But basically I can pull the format string off that. I can hand that to this utility, and this utility is automatically going to do the formatting for me, as you can see inside here, by simply calling value formatter format. And now I don't have to worry about any of the formatting. I just take the format string and pass it to a piece of code someone else has written inside there. If you want to start using these utilities, which I highly recommend, just go to the github.com Microsoft Power BI Visuals GitHub repository. If you scroll down a little bit to where it says table of contents and adding Power BI utils, so here is their documentation on usage and basically step-by-step of how you can add these to your projects. Okay, time for yet another visually gratuitous demo. It's kind of like a soccer game at the end of regulation. We're in penalty time. You're just not sure how much longer this is all going to go on. So Snazzy Table is just another project in the GitHub repository I referenced at the beginning. So let's go ahead and let's move over to that particular project folder. I'll go ahead and I'll start things up by doing a pbiviz start. And once we're able to start this up and run it, we should now be able to go back to the browser and basically add in our Snazzy table. Now, nothing happens until we start adding values in. Notice that, let's go ahead and take a column, such as sales region, and we'll add that in. Okay, next, I'll take a measure, sales revenue, and we'll add that in. And just like the table visual, I want a single well that anyone can add any fields into that they want. Now, if we go back to Visual Studio and we take a look at the capabilities.json file, I've defined a single data role, and its kind is grouping or measure, saying allow the user to add either columns or measures inside there. Also, I put the max at 5 right here. So the idea is that the user can add, a certain number of things inside there, but once we've added too many things inside, we want to stop the number at 5. Okay, so now you've seen that inside there. Back here, you can also see that we're using a table mapping. Last visual, I did a table single mapping. Now I'm doing a table mapping. And the idea is if I go ahead and switch over to the mapping view, and then I look down into the table view inside here, I can basically see the rows, and I can basically see row by row, column 1, 2, and 3. Well, how do I get information about the columns? while you can get it from the table view, you can also go back to metadata, and that will give you information. And the first column is in the columns array at position 0. Okay, that's great. Let's go back here and just take a quick look at the code. And so inside of update, we're going to make sure that our data view is valid. So we have at least one field inside there. I can get the data table view. I can get the metadata view inside there. And so once we've got that inside, we're able to go through column by column and create the headers. I'm using the PBI extensibility utils, just like I did in the last demo. And now we're basically going row by row, and for each row, column by column, and basically building things out inside there. Okay, so basically I'm just using jQuery to build out a table. Now, one more thing I want to call out is that as people are using this, and all of a sudden, they're able to get this particular table, let's look at properties. And what I want to call out is that we don't just have one property for the visual to set the bold formatting, but we have one per column. And someone is able to go into the individual columns one by one and mark them as bold or not bold. Now, the secret to creating these, what are called dynamic properties, not static properties, let's go back into the data view, is that while there is a objects collection that might hang off metadata, there's many other things that have objects collections as well. So down here, if I keep drilling down, and what we'll see here is for sales revenue, we'll have objects, and basically things get added inside there. Now, the way to get these dynamic properties, let's go ahead and go back to the capabilities.json file. So this code is no different than how you would define a property for a static object. What's different is, let's look at the code inside of enumerate object instances. So here inside of enumerate object instances, what we're going to do is when it's time to add something in, instead of calling object enumeration push one time, we're going to have a for loop and basically go to each particular column and add that in. Now, there's a couple things that are tricky. One is you need to set the display name inside there. So the idea here is when the user is looking down there, they want to see just the column name as the display name. Okay. And then secondly, when we add that in, we have to add a selector value. And so if you call current column and get the query name, which is basically the column name, that adds it to the selector and allows you to have properties that write into a persistent space particular to that particular object. Okay, going back to my soccer analogy, we're done with penalty time, we've gone through overtime, and now we're down to penalty kicks. Without a doubt, the very last demo, packaging a custom visual for distribution. So now imagine I'm all done developing the snazzy table visual, and I'm ready for distribution. So the first thing I want to do is review what's in the pbiviz file. So notice that there's a name. Users aren't going to see that, but the display name, snazzy table, I'll go ahead and put a space inside there. Now there's also the visual class name. So remember that by default, the name is visual and your class is named visual. If you want to change the name of your class, you change it here, but then you also have to change it here to keep those two in sync. What's the version, description, things like that. So if I want to put information about me, the author, all that can go inside here. Okay, so now that we've built that, we'll go ahead and we'll save. Now, let's look at this particular folder. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back and I'll stop the debugger from running by Control-C and then Y return. And so now that we've done that, we're going to use pbiviz, and there is a package command. So let's go ahead and run the package command. And as I run the package command, what you're going to see is that it's going to build a pbiviz file for you, and basically that is your distributable. So it generated this dist folder inside there, and so there's my visual. Hey, that's great. Let's go back here. Let's forget about using the developer visual, and now let's go ahead and just add that visual. So I'm going to say import custom visual, just like we did earlier. So now we're going to have to go and seek and find that. So if I go into student, custom visuals, and snazzy table, it always builds it into the dist folder. Let's go ahead and add that inside. Now we've imported our custom visual. There's the snazzy table. Let's go ahead and add it in. And let's go ahead and put it to work inside there. Let's go ahead and then add the sales region. Let's go ahead and put sales region above revenue inside there. Let's go ahead and add units sold. If I want, I can go and change the custom properties. And now that I've created my custom visual, we'll go ahead and save the report, and that's saved along with it. Okay, now let's say that I want to add it to Power BI Desktop. So one thing to note about custom visuals is while you're developing, they're easy to test in the browser, yet you can't really test them inside of Power BI Desktop unless you build them. So notice that once I've built this in top, I can now go and import my custom visual. And once again, here I am in Power BI Desktop. Let's go back and let's find my particular distribution file, snazzytable.pbiviz. Let's go ahead and add that inside. And so now on this particular project, I have the snazzy table inside here as well. Well, that was a lot of content. Let's go ahead and recap what we learned. Well, first of all, I gave an introduction to what custom visuals are all about. It's an extensible aspect of the Power BI platform that makes Power BI way cooler than any other data analytics platform. Second, we started programming in TypeScript, and we started programming with D3. Those are separate learning curves, and note that you can divide and conquer and start doing TypeScript and D3 tutorials without involving the other complexity of the Power BI visual infrastructure. We got up and going with the pbiviz utility, which is key to create projects and debug them. We had to go through and see how we design custom visuals by implementing capabilities. And then finally, we looked at packaging. Let me just end with a quick word on my company, Critical Path Training. If you're looking for hands-on instructor-led training on Power BI, go to our site, criticalpathtraining.com. And if you take a look, we have a Power BI developer bootcamp. So day one, we drill down on how to create Power BI desktop projects. Day two is pretty much what we covered here, drilling down on creating custom visuals with TypeScript, D3, and using the different tool sets. Day three is our day where we look at the R data analytics platform and discuss how to program with R, how to integrate R code into Power BI Desktop, and then how to bottle up the work that you've done with Power BI in R by creating a custom R visual. And then day four, we're doing a lot of C# programming with the Power BI REST API and looking at the Power BI embedded platform. Last but certainly not least, let's not forget about the Power BI community at community.powerbi.com and our ability to use the different forums for things like desktop and developer. And let me call out the brand new custom visuals development discussion right there. So if you're along with me and you're starting to develop some of these custom visuals, please spend some time here with us in the custom visuals community. Thanks very much for watching this video.